A senior director told me a story that I think captures something most leaders never think about. She had been with the organization for 14 years. She had turned down two external offers because she believed in the organization's culture. And while she trusted the trajectory her career was on, then a restructuring was announced. Her role wasn't eliminated, it was redefined. Her title changed. Her reporting structure changed. Half the team that she had built over a decade was reassigned to someone else. No one asked for her input. She found out in an organization-wide email. When I asked her how she felt, she didn't say frustrated. She didn't say that she was angry. She said, I'm betrayed. She said, I gave them 14 years. I turned down other opportunities. And, well, they couldn't even tell me to my face. Here's the thing. The organization hadn't broken any legal agreement. Her employment contract remained intact. Her compensation unchanged. On paper, well, everything was fine. But something far more important than paper had been devastated. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand exactly what that was and why it may be one of the most overlooked reasons that your best people are quietly disengaging right now. I'm Kevin Novak, CEO of 2040 Digital, professor at the University of Maryland, and author of the book, The Truth About Transformation, Leading in the Age of AI, Uncertainty, and Human Complexity, along with the Ideas and Innovations weekly newsletter. Welcome to the Human Factor Podcast, the show that explores the intersection of humanity, technology, and transformation, along with the psychology behind transformation success. This is season 2, and this is the 7th episode of the season. If you've been following the season, we've been building a diagnostic framework for understanding why transformation fails at the very human level. Episode 1 explored identity crisis. Episode 2 examined emotional contagion. Episode 3 unpacked the structural traps of middle management. Episode 4 looked at the algorithmic mirrors. Episode 5, with my buddy Jim Elliott, examined the organization's immune system. And last episode, episode 6, we explored structural silence, the system that trains people not to speak. Today, we're going deeper than any of those episodes went. We're exploring the psychological contract, the unwritten, unspoken set of mutual expectations between an employee and their organization. This is the invisible agreement that governs how people actually experience their working lives. And when transformation violates it, the damage goes far beyond resistance. It feels like betrayal. I wrote about a related dimension of this in my Ideas and Innovations newsletter issue on the loyalty trap, when commitment becomes a cage. I explored how organizations often mistake loyalty-driven hesitation for resistance during transformation. So today's episode takes that concept deeper. We're going to examine the underlying contract that makes loyalty feel like a trap in the first place. Think about your own career for a moment. Think about the expectations you carry into your job every day that no one ever wrote down. Expectations about how decisions get made, how your contributions are valued, what loyalty earns you, how much autonomy you have, and what your future looks like. Now, think about what happens when an organization violates those expectations without ever acknowledging that they even existed. The research on this is both fascinating and very sobering. Denise Rousseau at Carnegie Mellon University, who's widely considered the foundational scholar on psychological contracts, demonstrated that these unwritten agreements are more powerful predictors of employee behavior than formal employment terms. When the psychological contract is honored, people go above and beyond. When it's violated, they don't just disengage. They recalibrate every assumption that they hold about the organization. And, well, they do it quietly, which is why most leaders never see it coming. That quiet recalibration is what we're unpacking today. And I want you to hold on to something as we go through this. Every person on your team right now is operating under a contract that nobody signed, nobody negotiated, and nobody can point to on paper. The question is then whether your transformation just honored it or completely destroyed it. Let me ground this in some research, because psychological contracts are not just a metaphor. They are one of the most extensively studied concepts in organizational psychology, and the implications for transformation are profound. Denise Rousseau's foundational work, beginning in the late 1980s and continuing through her most recent publications, established that every employment relationship contains an implicit set of mutual obligations that exist alongside the formal employment agreement. The employee develops beliefs about what the organization owes them: fair treatment, opportunities for growth, job security, recognition, and autonomy. And the organization, well, it develops expectations about what the employee owes in return: effort, loyalty, flexibility, and commitment. What makes psychological contracts uniquely powerful is that they are individually constructed. Two people in the same role with the same manager can hold very different psychological contracts based on their experiences, their conversations with leadership, the promises that they believed were made during hiring, and the pattern that they observe over time. This means that a single organizational action, like a restructuring that I mentioned earlier, or a new technology deployment, can simultaneously honor one person's psychological contract and completely violate another's. Rousseau identified two primary types of psychological contracts. Transactional contracts are those that are very straightforward. I provide my time and skills, you provide compensation, and you define working conditions. These contracts are very narrow. They're very specific. And well, they're relatively easy to manage because both sides understand the terms. Relational contracts are where transformation gets really dangerous. These are the broader, more emotionally grounded expectations about belonging, loyalty, career progression, identity, and mutual investment. A relational contract might include beliefs like, if I give this organization my best years, they'll invest in my development. If I'm loyal during difficult times, that loyalty will be recognized and reciprocated. If I've built something valuable here, I will have a voice in decisions about its future. Well, none of these expectations are written in any offer letter, but they are as real to the person holding them as any legal document. Here's the critical insight from Rousseau's research that connects directly to our Season 2 framework so far. When a transactional contract is violated, people feel shortchanged. When a relational contract is violated, people feel betrayed. And betrayal, well, it triggers a fundamentally different psychological response than disappointment. Betrayal activates the identity protection mechanism that we discussed in episode 1. It spreads through emotional contagion that we explored in episode 2. It's amplified by the structural dynamics of episode 3. And, well, it feeds directly into the organizational immune system of episode 5. Well, because perceived betrayal becomes one of the most powerful cultural antibodies an organization can produce. Sandra Robinson and Elizabeth Morrison's research extended Rousseau's work by examining what happens after a perceived contract is violated. Once the psychological contract was perceived as broken, employees began viewing routine decisions through a lens of suspicion. A restructuring that might have been seen as strategic became evidence of bad faith. A new initiative that might have generated enthusiasm became another potential betrayal. I want to pause on that for a moment because it's important. Psychological contract violation doesn't just damage the present, it contaminates the future. Every organizational action that follows gets filtered through the experience of betrayal. And this is why some organizations find that resistance seems to compound over time rather than diminish. It's not that people are becoming more resistant. It's that each successive change is being evaluated against an increasingly damaged psychological contract. Now, let me connect this directly to what happens during organizational transformation. Because most leaders have no idea how many psychological contracts that they're violating simultaneously. The first and the most common violation is the autonomy breach. It's when organizations implement new systems, new workflows, or new decision-making structures. They often reduce the autonomy that employees have accumulated over years. A senior manager who used to make budget decisions now needs to route everything through a new approval system. A team lead who had flexibility in how they organize their work is now required to follow a standardized process. The formal rationale is consistent and efficient. The psychological experience, well, is that the organization just told you it doesn't trust your judgment anymore. Explored a related dynamic in my newsletter issue on survival mode leadership, the hidden cost of managing by fear. When leaders create environments where autonomy is stripped away, even with what are seemingly good intentions, the psychological message that people receive is that they aren't trusted. And trust, once damaged, becomes the lens through which everything else is interpreted. The second violation is the career trajectory breach. When transformation restructures roles, flattens hierarchies, or introduces new skill requirements, it can destroy the career path that someone believed they were on. Here's what leaders miss. The person doesn't just lose a future role. They lose the narrative that they've been telling themselves about why their investment in this organization was worthwhile. I wrote about this in my newsletter on the human factor behind employee retention. I explored how job embeddedness, the links, the fit, and the sacrifice that keep people committed, and how that can unravel when the organization changes the terms that made those sacrifices feel worthwhile. The third violation is the recognition breach. This is one subtle but incredibly devastating one. Organizations in the middle of transformation often shift their attention, the resources, and the recognition towards new capabilities, new hires, and new ways of working. The people who built the organization to its current state, the ones whose institutional knowledge made transformation even possible, can suddenly feel invisible. Their expertise is reframed as legacy thinking. Their experience becomes a liability rather than an asset to the organization. The psychological contract that said your contributions matter and will be recognized gets replaced with an unspoken message that says what got us here won't get us there, and that includes you. Well, this connects directly to the identity crisis we explored in episode 1. When recognition shifts away from what you've contributed to what you need to become, it doesn't just change your job. It threatens your professional identity. And as we discussed in that episode, identity protection is one of the most powerful drivers of human behavior. The fourth violation is the voice breach. And this connects directly to episode 6 on structural silence. When transformation decisions are made without input from the people most affected, the psychological contract around having a voice in decisions that affects your work gets violated. People don't expect to make every decision, but they do expect to be consulted on decisions that fundamentally change how they work, who they work with, and what their future looks like. When that consultation doesn't happen, even when time pressures seem to make it impractical, the message received is very clear. Your perspective doesn't matter. The fifth violation is what I call the loyalty reciprocity breach. This is perhaps the deepest contract violation and the one that causes the most lasting damage. It occurs when employees who have demonstrated sustained loyalty, who have stayed through difficult periods, who have sacrificed personal opportunities for the organization's benefit, discover that their loyalty is not reciprocated. The restructuring that eliminates their team without consultation, the reorganization that promotes externally hired leaders over internal candidates who have earned their place, the transformation initiative that treats 15 years of institutional knowledge as an obstacle rather than an asset. Well, I explored this directly in my newsletter on the loyalty trap, when commitment becomes a cage. Loyal employees don't resist change because they're rigid. They resist because transformation often violates the very contract that made them loyal in the first place. And treating that resistance as a problem to be overcome rather than a signal to be understood is how organizations lose the people they can afford to lose the least. Think here about your own organization right now. How many of these 5 violations has your current change or transformation triggered? Here's the harder question for you. Would you even know? Here's what makes psychological contract violation so very dangerous for transformation. It doesn't stay contained. One perceived violation cascades through every dimension of the employee's relationships with the organization. Neil Conway and Rob Briner conducted extensive meta-analysis on psychological contract breach. What they found was that the consequences extend far beyond the individual. When employees perceive that their psychological contract has been violated, they don't just reduce their own engagement. They communicate that violation to their peers. They share stories. They warn new employees. They create the cultural narratives that become the immune system's antibodies from episode 5, along with the structural silence of episode 6. Remember the compliance director from last episode. She stayed silent about data vulnerability for 4 months. Imagine that same scenario, but now add the context that she had recently experienced a psychological contract violation. Perhaps she had been passed over promotion that she believed was implicitly promised. Perhaps her team had been restructured without her input. Well, suddenly her calculation about whether to speak up isn't just about organizational safety. It's now colored by a sense that the organization has already broken faith with her. So why take the personal risk of raising a concern for an organization that doesn't honor its commitments to you? This is how psychological contract violation feeds directly in the structural silence. When people feel betrayed, the threshold for speaking up rises dramatically. The emotional energy required to advocate for an organization that has violated your trust is simply more than most people are willing to invest. Daniel Kahneman's loss aversion research, which I referenced in episode 6, is particularly relevant here. People experience the psychological pain of contract violation approximately twice as intensely as they experience equivalent gains. A broken promise of a career advancement hurts more than a surprise promotion feels good. A violation of trust damages more than an act of trust building repairs. This asymmetry means that organizations need to make multiple positive deposits in the psychological contract for every single withdrawal. Then during transformation, when withdrawals are happening rapidly and often invisibly, the account can go bankrupt before even leadership recognizes that there's a deficit. There's also a temporal dimension that most leaders completely underestimate. The relationship between psychological contract violation and trust is not linear. It follows what I describe in my newsletter on the relationship decay rate as an exponential pattern. Once trust begins to erode, the decay accelerates. A small violation that may have been absorbed in a high trust environment becomes amplified in an environment where trust is already declining. This creates a compounding effect where successive transformation action causes disproportionately more damage than the last. I see this pattern far too much in the organizations I work with at 2040 Digital. By the time leadership recognizes that something's wrong, they're not dealing with one broken contract. They're dealing with dozens of interconnected violations that have been compounding for months. And their standard response? A town hall meeting, a leadership message about the vision, a new engagement survey. Well, it does nothing to address the underlying contract damage. In many cases, it makes it worse because employees interpret these gestures through the same lens of distrust. So let me ask you this directly. If you're leading a transformation right now, when was the last time you asked your team not what they think about the changes, but what they expected this organization to be for them? And, well, whether those expectations are still being met. Here's the good news, and I want to be clear that there is good news in this. Unlike a broken legal contract, a psychological contract can be repaired. It can even be renegotiated, but only if leaders are willing to do something that most find very deeply uncomfortable. They have to acknowledge that the contract exists and, well, that the organization may have violated it. This is where the concept of psychological contract breach versus violation becomes important here. Rousseau's research distinguishes between both. A breach, well, is the cognitive recognition that a promise or expectation has not been fulfilled. A violation is the emotional response to that recognition, the feelings of betrayal, of anger, and the resulting damaged trust. You can have a breach without a violation if the organization acknowledges the breach and provides a credible explanation. But you cannot have a violation without lasting damage to the relationship. What this means in practice is that the single most powerful thing a leader can do during transformation is to name the contract before breaking it. If a restructuring is going to eliminate rules, change the reporting structures, or redefine career paths, the leader who says, I know many of you came to this organization with certain expectations about your career trajectory, and this change may disrupt those expectations. I want to acknowledge that directly, and I want to work with you to build a new path. Well, saying that is doing something fundamentally different from the leader who simply announces the change and expects people to adapt. The first approach here treats the psychological contract as real and very much worthy of respect. The second approach pretends it doesn't even exist, which is experienced as double violation. First, the broken promise, then the denial that a promise was ever made. I wrote about a similar dynamic in my newsletter on the meeting after the meeting. I explored how strategies and plans lose support not because of what's said in the official meeting, but because of the conversations that happen afterwards. Psychological contract violations, well, they work the same way. The official communication announces the change. The meeting after the meeting is where people process what that change means for the implicit promises they believed were actually in place. There are several practical approaches leaders can take here. First, conduct a contract audit before launching transformation. This doesn't need to be formal or named as such. It just means having honest conversations with your teams about what they value most about working in this organization, what they believe they were promised implicitly and explicitly, and what would feel to them like a betrayal. These conversations are going to be uncomfortable. They are also going to be the most valuable intelligence that you can gather as a leader. Second, distinguish between contracts that must be broken and contracts that can remain being honored. Not every psychological contract is able to survive transformation. But leaders who thoughtfully separate the contracts that they must violate from those that they can preserve and then communicate clearly about both dramatically reduce the collateral damage. If the career paths are changing, but the organization's commitment to development isn't, say that explicitly and then back it up with some action. If the reporting structures are shifting, but the value placed on institutional knowledge isn't, demonstrate that through how decisions are made. Third, create space for what I call legitimate grieving. I referenced this in the concept in my newsletter on the loyalty trap. I argued that loyal employees need permission to grieve what's being lost before they can commit to what's being built. This applies directly to the psychological contract violation. When a contract is broken, even necessarily, there's going to be a loss. The person who expected a certain career path has lost that future. The team that operated with a certain level of autonomy has lost their freedom. Denying the loss or rushing past it doesn't make it go away. It drives it underground where it compounds and becomes part of the structural silence that we discussed last episode. Fourth, rebuild the contract explicitly. After transformation disrupts the old psychological contract, leadership must actively construct a new one. This means being explicit about what the organization commits to going forward, not in vague aspirational terms, but in specific observable behaviors. We commit to consulting affected teams before making structural changes. We commit to internal first advancement for leadership roles. We commit to recognizing institutional knowledge as a strategic value. These aren't just communication strategies. They are the terms of a new psychological contract, and they only work if the organization honors them consistently over time. Fifth, measure contract health rather than just engagement. Most engagement surveys measure surface level satisfaction. They don't capture the state of psychological contract. Ask questions then to probe the implicit promises. Do you believe this organization values your long-term contributions? Do you feel your career expectations are being honored? Do you trust that your loyalty will be reciprocated? These questions reveal contract health in ways that standard engagement metrics never will. Let me now connect the psychological contract back to our full season 2 framework. Well, because this concept is, in many ways, the invisible engine that powers everything that we've explored. The identity crisis from episode 1 is fundamentally a psychological contract violation. When transformation threatens your professional identity, it's because the implicit contract said your expertise is valued here has been violated. Emotional contagion from episode 2 is the transmission mechanism for contract violation. When one person's sense of betrayal spreads to their peers, what's actually spreading is the recognition that the organization's implicit promises can't be trusted. Structural traps from episode 3 are intensified by contract violation because middle managers whose own contracts have been breached are in no position to absorb the contract violations of the people that they lead. Algorithmic mirrors from episode 4 can expose contract violations by making visible the gaps between what organizations say they value and how they actually allocate resources and recognition. The organization's immune system from episode 5 is activated by contract violation. The cultural antibodies that attack transformation, the narrative neutralization, the procedural adoption, the champion isolation, all of these are intensified when people feel the organization has broken faith. And well, structured silence from episode 6 is at its core a response to accumulated contract violations. People stop speaking up because the implicit contract that said your voice matters has been violated far too many times. The psychological contract is the thread that runs through every episode. It's the underlying agreement that, when honored, makes transformation possible. And when it's violated, it generates the identity crisis, the emotional contagion, the structured rigidity, the algorithmic blind spots, the immune responses, and silence that collectively kills organizational change. As I wrote about in my newsletter on the case for strategic patience, leaders earn credibility by demonstrating sound judgment through consistent execution. Teams that have seen commitments honored and plans delivered are capable of engaging constructively with larger ambitions. That's the psychological contract in action. When it's intact, people will follow you through uncertainty. When it's broken, no amount of vision or strategy is going to overcome the damage. I want to leave you with something to sit with. Right now, at this moment, every person in your organization is carrying an invisible contract. They believe they know what the organization owes them and what they owe in return. That contract shapes every decision that they make, from how much discretionary effort they invest, to whether they speak up in meeting, to whether they stay or start quietly looking elsewhere. Your transformation initiative just wrote a new chapter in that contract. The question is whether it was a chapter about trust or a chapter about betrayal. And the answer has nothing to do with your business case, your technology platform, or your project plan. It has everything to do with whether the people being asked to change believe the organization still honors the promises it made when it asked for their commitment. Here's the truth most leaders don't want to hear. The psychological contract is always being written. Every decision, every communication, every restructuring, every moment of recognition of its absence adds terms to the psychological agreement. You don't get to decide whether the psychological contract exists. You only get to decide whether you're writing it intentionally or accidentally. And the organizations that lose their best people are almost always the ones writing it by accident. Silence here is not the problem. It is the signal. I said that last episode. Today, I'm going to add this. When your best people go silent, they're not disengaging from work. They're disengaging from the contract. And by the time you notice, well, the terms have already been rewritten in ways that no town hall or engagement survey can undo. If you found today's episode valuable, subscribe to the Human Factor podcast wherever you watch or listen to podcasts. Leave a rating and a comment. Share this episode with your leadership team, because understanding the psychological contract is understanding the difference between transformation that sticks and transformation that silently collapses from within. For weekly insights about transformation psychology, organizational behavior, and the human factors that determine transformation success, subscribe to my Ideas and Innovations newsletter on 2040 Digital's website or on Substack at 2040.substack.com. Several of the newsletter issues that I referenced today go deeper into the concepts that we cover, including the loyalty trap, the relationship decay rate, the meeting after the meeting, and survival mode leadership. Those are all available in the newsletter archive. Connect with me on LinkedIn as well. I post regularly about the psychology of transformation, and I would love to hear from listeners about their own experience with psychological contract violations in their organizations. What implicit promises has your organization made and broken? That's a conversation worth having. Special note here, we'll be on a mid-season break returning the third week of April. When we return, we have a series of great guests over 6 episodes bringing substantive conversations with me with the goal of bringing you field-tested, practical strategies and tactics that they have used in navigating the human factor. It's going to be an exciting 6 weeks. This is the Human Factor Podcast. I'm Kevin Novak. Thanks for watching or listening.